Today we will be doing a mixed media portrait of two pugs. This was actually a commission of one of my friends gave me this to do. And this is in two parts. We will be breaking it down into. So today I'll be covering the first part, and this will be focusing on the background. So some materials that I will be using are the Cotman watercolor paper. This is what we will be using for our watercolors, particularly in the background and on the main subject. The Faber-Castell Polychromos. I'm using my 36 set here since I don't think I need a ton of colors for this, since we will be adding the colored pencils on just as a finishing touch to the painting, I would say. A variety of different paintbrushes. I have a really fine round paintbrush, as you can see right here. This will be where I added in all the tiny little details. I have a flat, kind of smaller paintbrush. This will just be what I use for parts of the fur. I'll also be using this for parts of the fur and also for the background because it has a round, as you can see, a round end on it. The bristles are round. On here, I will also be using a Princeton, it's a wash brush, 1 inch. This is great for doing in larger strokes that I'll be using. And really in the background, it will be blurry, and in the foreground and the main subjects will be much more detailed and crisp. I also have a Kimberly HB General USA pencil. This will be for the sketch that we'll be doing. I also have a kneaded eraser to go with this. This is super helpful to lightening up those sketches because when you're doing watercolor, you really do not want the pencil to be showing through. I also have some tissue for lifting up highlights. This can be a good technique in watercolor. I find this helpful for clouds when I'm doing my paintings out in landscapes. I would use these to lighten it up, but I'll also be using this in the background and the fur. I have a paper plate. I go actually pretty cheap on my budget for art supplies for this kind of stuff because honestly I always end up throwing away the paint that I don't use, so I just recommend using a paper plate. It's much easier than having to buy a really expensive easel. I'd rather spend the money in other things like quality pencils and paints than a fancy palette. And then of course our drawing paper. This is a mixed media Strathmore paper. I believe it's 11 by 14, and this is what we'll be painting on. Also, I keep a spare one of these that has test on it, where I test out all my techniques, as you can see on here. I tested out this eye before I started painting. So anyways, those are the techniques that I've chosen for this drawing. But I did forget to mention that throughout the month of December, from December 1st to December 12th, I'll be doing something known as the 12 Days of Christmas. This will be a drawing challenge where I will be uploading a new video every single day from December 1st to December 12th on YouTube. This could be a speed drawing, a speed painting, or a tutorial video with multiple segments in it, like the one that I'm doing today. So head on over to my channel to check out more content like this, and please do consider subscribing if you found my content useful. So right now I'm starting off with, I'm putting my paper down on the easel, and I am doing it at an inclined plane because I feel that when I do it at an inclined plane, it gives it more of a three-dimensional look to it. So what I'm doing right now is I'm starting to sketch in my basic elements and the components of my sketch. So I'm starting off with some basic lines, and by the way, I'm using an HB pencil, and I'm trying to be very light-handed. You need to be light-handed so that the pencil does not show up when you're doing the watercolor. And also, you can see I just started right there, and I had to erase it because it wasn't proportional and representational, and then I redid it again. So you have to continue doing it until you are satisfied with your sketch, because if you don't have a correct sketch down, then everything will look improportional and not correct. Right now, I'm adding some of the eyes into the animals, and it may look kind of dark right now, but I'm gonna lighten it up with a kneaded eraser, and you'll see that. And I always, whenever I'm sketching something, when I try to get the correct proportions, I always start off with bigger shapes, and then I try to get smaller and smaller into detail. So I think the big key concept is that a lot of beginners face when they are doing these kind of observational, and this is more of an observational, not representational painting. I mean, it has a few elements that are going to be representational of these dogs, but it'll mostly be observational. I find a lot of beginners, they just go straight into drawing little tiny details and don't take in the big picture first. So I think it's important to take in the big picture first. And I can definitely relate to this. I remember at the very beginning of my drawing journey, and still even a little bit today, I go too much into the details at the very beginning, and I kind of leave out the focus. So I really think it's important that you take in the bigger picture first before you do that. Also, another way to get an accurate method is to use the grid method for proportional sketching. Now in this case, I didn't use the grid method, but I used something similar to the grid method a little bit. I drew a cross down the center of my page, and I divided it into fourths. And then from there, I saw where each line intersected with the center line, or the vertical center line. So that really helped me get in my proportions correctly. You can see I'm going back over and adjusting some things. It's important that you also pay attention to the composition of your portrait. And by the way, if you don't know what I mean by the composition, I mean in how things are arranged in your piece. So as you can see, the dog that I have sketched on the left is in a 3/4 view, and it's kind of looking at the viewer, but really not. It's looking more towards the side of something, so it can kind of see you. Whereas the dog in the bottom right corner is looking at the viewer. So you want to make sure that you have the right sense of movement in your composition. So that's how I balanced it out. And also in this tutorial, we will not be doing, in this part, we won't be doing the animals. We will just be doing the background, and we'll be doing this in watercolor. But I do want to make sure that I get in the whole sketch accurate, so that it'll look realistic. And that's the goal of these commissions that I'm doing, is I want them to look realistic, especially because it's a paid thing, and I want it to look observational rather than representational. So I'm adding in some of the letters to the collar right now, the bandana, and it's really important that you get it as much as you can close to the photo reference. Now I'm starting to lighten up the sketch. Lightening up sketches is really important, because once you lighten up the sketch, it makes it look, the figures do not look outlined anymore, and the background doesn't look outlined. In real life, we're not outlined figures. Anyways, more on that coming up next, but right now all I'm doing is pre-wetting the paper. And I'm going to be using something known as the wet-on-wet technique. The wet-on-wet technique is basically where I apply wet water to the paper, and it's a very loose form of painting, especially in watercolors. And we want the background to be loose and blurry, because when I edited this photo, I wanted the emphasis to be on the two pugs rather than the background. So that's why we're going to make it very blurry. So, and I also find that this technique is good for kind of expressive painting. So if you're doing something that's very loose and stuff. Now I'm not saying this painting's loose, I'm just saying the background is going to be blurry, so we don't want super harsh edges. We want gradient value changes in color changes. So that's something really important to pay attention to. Also, now I'm adding in some black over in the background. As you can see right there, it looks like it's the floor. One important thing to make sure when you're applying black, now I know some artists have weird rules, have some rules like don't ever use black, it makes your colors look dull. I can see the truth in some of these painting rules and drawing rules, but at the same time I kind of find them unnecessary, or they're almost like misconceptions, because the black doesn't really, if something's black, then make it look black. But what I think they want you to get out of that is that, especially, and I've had art teachers that have said not to use black before, but I think really what they want you to get out of that is not to just put black on top and nothing else on top of it. So whenever you're doing black, put another color, put another color on top of it. So like glaze, like if it's really think about it. Is it really pure black, or is it like a dark blue or a dark green or a dark brown? Because very rarely in real life you will find things that are like almost pure black. So it's really important. If you want your drawing to look more lively and less cartoony, I guess you could say, add some color to your black. I'm not saying to avoid black at all, but add a little bit of color to it. So right now I'm adding in some more watercolor. I'm making sure I mixed up this color. I think it was burnt umber and a little bit of ultramarine blue to get this kind of grayish color in between. I'm also glazing some black over the top, but remember, like what I said, we don't leave black by itself. So once this dries, I'm going to glaze some brown over it so it looks actually like a dark brown part of the wood. So also you might notice in this stage of the drawing, it doesn't look, the painting, it might not look very realistic. It might look very loose and abstract, and that's okay, because the painting hasn't even taken much of its shape yet. We're just getting the very basic loose forms. I also added the couch in to the top right, and I mixed, I believe it was a little bit of gray, black and white, and a little bit of burnt umber and ultramarine blue. That's another way you can make a good gray. So a lot of people think the only way to make gray is to use black and white, but really you can mix a dark brown and a dark blue, and you'll get a pretty neutral color, and then add white to it. So you'll get something that looks close to black, and then if you add white, you'll get like a gray. So that's like the more, I guess, color theory way to do it. So now I'm adding in the carpet in the back. I'm using directional strokes that go with the pattern of the carpet. And I find the wet-on-wet technique can be a little challenging at first, because you have to be really careful. It can easily bleed into each other if you're not careful with it. I find that a lot of beginners and students, they're just starting off. They don't really pay attention to where they should use the wet technique and where they shouldn't use the wet-on-wet technique. I recommend using wet-on-wet techniques for areas that do not have much emphasis, like the background and stuff, and things that are supposed to be smooth or kind of like more, less transparent. Whereas I would use the wet-on-dry technique, which you'll see me use in the next, or the second part of this commission, for things like with more detail, such as the animal, fur, its eyes, and even some of the clothing too. So I'm just building up layers, and now I'm adding actually my colored pencil over the top. And this is after I've waited for all the watercolor to dry. I find that when you use watercolor underneath your colored pencils, it makes it go so much quicker. Now I'm not saying this piece is quick at all. This is taking me a really long time. And you really got to focus on these longer drawings and really see what looks accurate, what doesn't, and pick out some things you want to focus on. So I'm going back in and I'm really redefining some of those edges and making them look more realistic and three-dimensional. Also, some of the hues are off. So, for example, the chair. I'm going in with my raw umber and yellow ochre to make it look more accurate, and even some burnt ochre. Now I'm darkening it up with a black colored pencil. And by the way, I'm using Faber-Castell polychromos, like what I said. Many of my other drawings, or when I first started drawing, I feel like I limited myself to colored pencils, but really, there's so many opportunities you can do with colored pencils. You don't just have to use colored pencils by themselves. You can incorporate other mediums into them, like watercolor. And I haven't really done this that much before, to be honest, with my commissions, so it's kind of an experiment. And I have to say, I'm so far satisfied with the results I'm getting by trying these new techniques. I'm adding in some, I guess you could call like little trinkets in the back, and that's part of it. And now I'm going to add, and I think I'm pretty much there. Alright, thank you for listening, and we'll see you in the next part. Bye, everybody.